So today I'm going to talk about a deep and highly important subject: how to hack Tamagotchis. For the last while, I've been reverse engineering Tamagotchis, trying to dump their code and figure out exactly how they work. Today I'm going to tell you a bit about what I learned, both about reverse engineering and Tamagotchis. But first, a bit about me. I've always been more of a software type. By day, I'm a security researcher at BlackBerry, and you'll notice my slides have a disclaimer in them. Just in case you thought my job involves hacking Tamagotchis, it rather unfortunately does not. I studied electrical engineering at university, but I learned more about making hardware, not breaking hardware. So really, this is my first foray into reverse engineering and hardware hacking. And just in case you didn't know, I'm a really big Tamagotchi fan. So what are Tamagotchis? Just in case people haven't seen them, they're a type of virtual pet toy. And the idea is that the screen displays your pet, and then you'll press the buttons and do things like feed your pet or clothe your pet and that sort of thing. But if you're thinking about them from the 90s, you probably remember back when Tamagotchi life was simple. Back when they just had to sit there and be fed and maybe be cleaned up after, and that was it. But nowadays, Tamagotchi life is much more complex. They can make friends, go to school, have jobs, and if they don't do that all right, they can forget about getting married or having kids. And how do they work? Well, the way they talk to each other is through an IR interface. So you'll press the buttons, and then your Tamagotchis can make friends or go for a visit or that sort of thing. Now, the specific Tamagotchi I looked at is called the Tamatown Tamago. And it's the Christmas Tamagotchi from 2010, and I recently updated my slides because I'm actually in denial about how long I've spent on this project. And it's the same as the smaller Tamagotchis, except it's made for little kids, so it's got bigger buttons, and it has this new feature, figures. And the idea is you put the figure on top, and then it unlocks things like extra games or extra shops that your Tamagotchi can shop at. So what were my goals here? Well, my big goal was to dump the code of the Tamagotchi. And what I wanted to find out here is what I call the deeper questions of Tamagotchi life. Things like, does waking up your Tamagotchi in the middle of the night make it unhappy? Or does how well you treat a Tamagotchi toddler affect how it behaves as a teenager? Also, I wanted to cheat at Tamagotchi. I wanted to have the happiest and the richest Tamagotchis alive. And finally, I wanted to have fun. Because you know all those cool kids going out, going to clubs, they just haven't discovered reverse engineering yet. And then there's one more thing, which is totally not my idea. I did not say this, but this is from the Make blog. The idea of decoding the IR and eventually running around, having my notebook impregnating innocent Tamagotchi devices amuses me greatly. So to start off, I'm going to go through some of the work I've done previously, and then most of my talk is going to focus on what I've done in the last couple of months. So to start off, when the Tamagotchi first came out, I ran to the store and bought 5 of them and said they were gifts. And then I took one and I tore it apart. And the board was actually a little bit boring. There was an EEPROM on it. That's the only persistent memory. And what was in it was actually pretty boring. And then there was a microcontroller covered in epoxy. And I also took apart a figure. And it turned out there were 2 types of figures. There were ones that are called light figures, which just had an unpopulated board. And then there were ones that were more expensive, full figures, and they had a blob on them. And that was really all I could figure out. So then I looked at that blob, and I knew I needed to remove the epoxy. So I tried a number of crazy methods that burned and dissolved and tore apart many Tamagotchis. And eventually Travis Goodspeed was kind enough to decap the chip with acid. And this is what I got, and it took a while to find out what it was, because it's not a very common microcontroller, or at least one that doesn't get decapped very often. So I ended up comparing the pads to the pad layouts on a bunch of data sheets. And I found out that it was a General Plus LCD controller. What's interesting here is that it uses mask ROM. So unfortunately, you can't reprogram it. and that poses some challenges with regards to dumping it. It also only has a bit of RAM. It runs 6502 like a Commodore, and it has an SPI output and an audio DAC. So at this point, I wanted to dump the mask ROM, and I had a few ideas. One thing I tried was dumping the EEPROM, and it wasn't very useful. It just had serialized data. I also looked for the test program. I went through the General Plus data sheet, and I found that every single microcontroller they make has a mandatory test program that is burned right into the ROM. And they won't say what that does, but my guess was that it probably contained code that would dump the code. Because it makes a lot of sense. Mask ROMs are very expensive up front, and then they charge a small amount for copies. So I imagined a lot of customers would be complaining their ROM was incorrect, so it made sense that would be some of the test functionality. So I tried really hard to get this. I tried to get a dev kit from General Plus, and they wanted an NDA. And I looked around a lot of other places, but at this point I really couldn't find it. So I moved on. The next thing I looked at was the figure ROM. Because I thought these figures, if they're doing games, if they're doing items, stores, that sort of thing, maybe they have the capability in there to execute code. And I also had the side motive that even if I couldn't execute code, I thought it would be really fun to do things like make custom Tamagotchi games. So I looked at the figures, and there was the unpopulated boards and the ones with the populated boards. And it turned out to be useful that they had both, because I once again had the pad layout. And it turned out that these were a General Plus SPI chip, which actually an SPI ROM. So I just assumed the figures used this ROM, even though I hadn't decapped them. So with that, I was able to figure out the pins that the figure goes on to. That picture is of the top of the Tamagotchi, where it'll slide on the figure. And then I was able to take apart the ROM and dump it. Now with the ROMs, the first bit of decoding them was actually fairly simple. There were big strings of A's and 5s, and since it was a 4-tone LCD, those were clearly images. So after a few decoding accidents, I was able to get all the images from the Tamagotchi. This was really interesting, and it gave me my first sort of insight into Tamagotchi behavior. It told me that I guess Tamagotchis aren't that smart. For example, there's text in them, and I would have thought they might have just made the text out of the alphabet, but they didn't do that. Actually, every piece of text they have a corresponding image for. Also, I thought for animations they might have some way to dynamically move pixels or sprites or that sort of thing, but that's not the case. For example, if you had the figure that had the item that was a dress for your Tamagotchi, if you dumped the figure, it would actually have a picture of every single image of every single Tamagotchi wearing a dress. So then I started looking at the rest of the ROM, and it wasn't so clear-cut. I did write a disassembler for a General Plus code, and I verified there was no code in there. But after that, I didn't have a lot of luck. It seemed to be some type of serialized data. And at this point, I realized that the way I'd probably figure this out was to be able to make my own figure. Because it's one thing just to look at a dumped ROM and figure out what it does. But when you start changing it, you can start figuring out if you're right about things and see what happens if you change them. So I did that. I tried quite a few microcontroller boards and eventually got one that was fast enough to simulate the ROM using bit banging. That's my rig right there. And then I was able to simulate a figure and do some cool things. You know, put my initials in the background of the Tamagotchi, or even put my picture on a Tamagotchi. But this was just the images. What I was really curious about was how the games work, because I thought this was, of all the figure functionality, the one that was the most likely to contain code. But it actually didn't contain any code at all. And actually, it turned out that every game was actually represented by 1 byte only, which I thought was strange, but it sort of made sense that what was happening was all the games were actually inside the Tamagotchi's main ROM, then it would just fetch this 1 byte and jump there, and then that would be the game. Then it would fetch the rest of the images from the external ROM as well. But what was even more interesting is when I started playing with this, I found it would jump to screens that were not games. So I'd change it to one value, and it would jump to your Tamagotchi eating, or I would change it to another value, and it would jump to, your Tamagotchi taking a shower. So From this I learned two things. First, that the Tamagotchi, once again, wasn't that smart, and it definitely didn't have any sort of concept of a screen stack or a state stack. For example, if I jumped to the meal screen this way and then hit the back button, it wouldn't go back to the screen I'd come from. It would go back to the main screen, which means that the Tamagotchi is really a big state machine, a jump table or a switch statement that pretty much goes through a number of clearly defined states and pretty much jumps cleanly from one to another. So that was sort of interesting. The other interesting thing was some of these codes would cause freezing. But at this point, I didn't know what it meant. I thought it could be jumping to an error code and just going into a tight loop. This could be memory corruption. It could also be exception handling. It was just doing, or I guess interrupts, because it's 6502, interrupt handling over and over and over. I just didn't know. But I was able to do some cool things. Here's an example of me cheating at Tamagotchi. This demo will allow the Tamagotchi to grow older through the figure. So yeah, that's, my Tamagotchis are now older than anybody else's Tamagotchis. So I wanted to play with this some more, and it was at this point I gave a talk at 29C3, and I got contacted by a couple of people who were wanting to play with the Tamagotchis themselves. And one guy, Mr. Blinky, he ordered his own set of figures, but when he opened his up, they contained Flash. And what it turned out is that there's actually three different types of figures. There's the light ones, which contain nothing, and the regular ones that contain a ROM. But actually, a year after this came out, they came up with an even more expensive type of figure called Wave 2 figures that are like pretty and detailed, but also, since they were a much smaller run, they had Flash in them. So this was really cool. I actually didn't need to simulate it at all, and I could just reprogram the Flash. And you'll notice the picture there, that has a wire in it, but that's completely unnecessary. I just didn't want to open up another one to take a second picture. All the lines are actually routed so that you can program Flash directly. So this is the rig that Mr. Blinky made, and you can see he's got the Flash programmer pins in the side, and he's actually got a switch in here, and then he can switch it so that if you put a figure on top, in one mode it will reprogram the figure, and then in the other mode it will just act like a normal Tamagotchi. And a guy called Asterisk did something similar, and his looked like this. And mine looked like this. But I promise it still worked. And for this, I was able to work on the figures much faster. So the next thing I was curious about was Tamagotchi items. And these are things that you will take your Tamagotchi to the store to buy. You know, things like clothing, and if you put it on, the Tamagotchi will dance around in their clothing. Or you can even buy your Tamagotchi a trip to Washington, D.C., and you can see at the bottom the statue of Lincoln that your Tamagotchi will go and visit. So I played with this, and I found it was a bytecode format, but not one that really had a lot of instruction behavior. There was one for playing sounds, one for displaying images, one for changing Tamagotchi stats. So if you give your Tamagotchi a hamburger, it'll get less hungry, but nothing that useful. But I did make a script you can use to make your own Tamagotchi item, and this is on GitHub if anyone's interested. And I used it to make my Tamagotchi do the Harlem Shake. this point that I started getting emails from people saying that by doing memes, my Tamagotchi research had become too practical, and I had to go back to my impractical roots before it was too late. So at this point, I'd pretty much gone through all the figure functionality, but I still didn't know how to dump the ROM. So I started thinking a lot about lots of the suggestions I'd been given. Ever since I've started this project, I've got a really large number of suggestions from various people on what I call the internet on how I should dump the ROM. And these are, a lot of them are over Twitter or email, also speaker comments. I'll even sometimes go to forums where people are talking about my research and see if I can glean any new ideas on how to work on it. It was kind of interesting. By far the most popular suggestion I got was to use a tool called ROMPAR. And this is written by Major Malfunction, and it's pretty much something that will take a large image of the ROM, and it'll decode the bits of it. And actually, it was kind of funny. As soon as this came out, that very morning, I saw it on Twitter. And then, like in the next hour, my phone started to explode, and I got tons and tons of people sending it to me, and then tons of emails, and someone even emailed the president of my hackerspace saying, "Can you please make sure that Natalie knows about ROMPAR?" So it was a pretty strong suggestion. The other suggestions I got that I thought was interesting, and the side is about roughly how many people told them to me, was I got a lot of completely unqualified, "You should use ROT." A lot of people suggested that I should circumvent Windows stat cookies, and that would solve all my problems. And they really liked, for whatever reason, this 2003 paper by David Litchfield, but there were some other ones I got as well. Probing the chip was another suggestion I got. And this one I actually thought a lot about, because most of the people who suggested it were actually people who were very serious reverse engineers. They either suggested that I probe the chip using the lines that were available, or else I decap it and put small probes on top. And like with the ROP, I got a lot of completely unqualified glitch it. And the final solution I heard a lot of was differential power analysis. So while some of these, they vary in quality and practicality, what I found is they really did help me distill what my problems were. And actually, they sort of pointed to two main ways I could reverse engineer the Tamagotchi. One being using hardware methods, actually trying to get the code out of the chip, and the other one being using software methods, trying to get code execution and dump it that way. And I started off with hardware methods just because that's what I got the most suggestions for. And here were what the options were. And they made me realize what my problems were. My problems really were that I did not have any equipment. You can imagine, unlike a lot of reverse engineering projects, I'm doing this all at my own expense, so I did not have anything very expensive I could use to reverse engineer the Tamagotchi. I didn't have any chemicals for decapping, and I don't have a microscope. I also don't have a test device, which it was something I didn't think would be a problem, but actually made a lot of things more challenging. There's a lot of things you can do if you can run your own code on a similar chip, and you can see what different instructions look like. You can try different behavior. But I didn't have that option. I just had one device with that chip on it with the code set. And my problems were not hardware security protections. I think a lot of people, when they hear about a project like this, they think about all the crazy reverse engineering people are doing, and they imagine the Tamagotchi as hardware security protections, but I guarantee you it does not. It is the cheapest chip you can find, and every challenge I had was due to cost savings, not because they were trying to prevent people like me from dumping the code. So this right away took out glitching it, because that's something you'll do only if you have actual security protections on your chip. Also, differential power analysis. That was something which a few people suggested, and it might be possible, but it was something that I thought would be a lot easier if I had a test chip that you could figure out what the instructions looked like on first. And I think without a chip, it would become a very, very hard problem. I thought a lot about probing the chip. And actually, I saw a really cool talk by Karsten Knowles and Dexter, where they built, for less than €1,000, this whole rig where they had a motor, and they could make a little needle go on the top of the chip and probe it and figure out things like instructions. But then I realized that I make circuits that look like this, and that might be out of my league just a little bit. So I started thinking a lot about optical decoding, which, of course, the first step would be to actually get the image, and then I'd start looking into things like using ROMPAR. I didn't have the equipment, but I did get contacted by a few people who did. One was a guy called John Mousehammer, and he's from a hackerspace in Colorado. And he contacted me saying that he'd seen my talk, and he wanted to decode the Tamagotchi ROM first. Tamagotchi hacking, it's a deeply competitive space. Anyhow, he went and decapped a Tamagotchi, and he put it under his light microscope. And theoretically, we worked out that it should have been 1 bit per 4 pixels, but we couldn't see anything. So there were kind of two possibilities here. One was that the bits were too small, which I think is possible, but I'm not 100% confident that's the case. The other possibility was that we weren't doing it correctly, that there might have been some need to grind the die before you could see the bits. And especially there's some types of mask ROM where the wires are on the bottom, so if that's what's actually inside this General Plus chip, that could be obscuring the bits as well. I just want to show you guys, this guy, he also did a slideshow of decapping, and this is something you don't see pictures of very often, so I thought I'd share this. This is the Tamagotchi in the acid. This is after it's been in the acid for a while. This was the first time he fished it out, and he hadn't left it in long enough. So you can see there's still epoxy there. And then you can see the Tamagotchi is really starting to dissolve in that last picture. And then this was the decapped image, and these are the close-ups of the memory, which rather unfortunately didn't have bits in it. So at this point, I wasn't sure if it needed more grinding or if I didn't have a high enough resolution image. But then I got contacted by someone with a scanning electron microscope and a fib, which I thought was absolutely amazing. And it turned out that this guy works at an oil company. And oil companies, they will use SEMs and fibs like an MRI machine. They'll take little scrapings off rocks and build this 3D model of the rock. And apparently they have tons and tons of these machines sitting around. I tell this guy, oh, I can't believe you have a SEM and a fib. And he's like, well, actually, we have 3. So I sent him off a die, and he put it in the queue. And unfortunately, it was a long queue, because you can imagine a Tamagotchi is their lowest priority item. And in the meantime, I started looking at software methods. And I'll also admit, I started to feel a little bit guilty about using such expensive equipment on a Tamagotchi. So I started thinking about all the software possibilities. And I had these two, which, yeah. But then I started thinking some more, and it did help me distill my problems somewhat. My problems were that I didn't know how to execute the code or dump the ROM, obviously. And the other one, which isn't necessarily obvious, is that I didn't have any debug outputs. There was no JTAG, nothing like that. If I had a vuln and it made my Tamagotchi crash, I had absolutely no idea what was causing it other than the sounds I heard and what I saw on the LCD. The other challenge was I didn't have any working code or shell code. So even if I thought I was moving my instruction pointer, I had no confidence that what I was jumping to was actual valid code. So those are kind of 3 big challenges. My problems weren't exploit mitigations like stat cookies. At least I thought it was highly unlikely on an embedded device like this that they would waste their stack on something like that, because the stacks are typically very small. Non-executable memory, that's a possibility. They wouldn't be doing it for security reasons here, but sometimes for cost reasons, the architecture may end up such a way that you can't execute the memory. But that wasn't my immediate problem. So one night I was talking about this on IRC, and I met the Hannah Montana hackers, or at least I think I did. And I started talking to these guys, and they were like, yeah, we hacked a Hannah Montana toy. And what we did was we somehow figured out we had code execution, and then we dumped, bit by bit, the memory to the screen of the Tamagotchi, or the Hannah Montana toy. And we took a picture every time, and then eventually we decoded the code. And this seemed like a cool idea. But the strangest thing is when this happened, I didn't really think about it. Then a week later, I was trying to find these guys, and I couldn't even remember what channel it was on. So I went on to every IRC channel I'd ever been on and said, have you seen the Hannah Montana hackers? And every single person said, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. One person even said, Natalie, I've checked the channel for the past year, the entire log. No one has said the word Hannah Montana. So I have no idea if I dreamed this thing or these guys exist, but I swear I met these people once, I was just never able to find them again. So this got me thinking that maybe it might be possible to execute code on a Tamagotchi, even though I didn't have any debug outputs. And what I started thinking about was, if you remember back when I was doing the games, I had all those codes that froze. At the top, I'd say there was maybe 20 or 30 that worked, and at the bottom, there were 20 or 30 that worked, but then there was this whole middle, and I didn't know what it did. And I also started reading up on 6502, and I found out a lot of interesting stuff there. For one, 6502 maps all its memory into a single address space. There's no MMU, and there's no invalid memory addresses. If you reference something that doesn't exist, it will usually return 0 or something invalid, depending on your platform, but it definitely won't crash or freeze. Also, invalid instructions will execute undefined behavior. So it can mean they'll freeze forever, but I heard that this is atypical. Most 6502 chips will actually just keep going if they get an invalid instruction. And also, I found that with those two, there's pretty much no way you can reset a 6502 chip. Unless you actually jump to the reset vector, they're just going to keep going and going and going. Which, if you think about it, that's actually really good for exploitation. Because if you jump to a location and maybe you're not quite right to where you jumped, you might go here and there and wherever and eventually get to your code. So that's actually pretty nice. So to start off, I thought, well, I have these game codes. Let's just pretend they're indexes in a jump table, and let's just hope I'm right about that. And then maybe we're indexing outside of the jump table and jumping to invalid addresses. And since the only RAM I could set was the LCD RAM, I could do that through the figure images. I thought, well, maybe I'll fill up my LCD RAM with shellcode and jump to it and just hope I got it right. And note, I'm hoping twice here. I'm hoping that I'm jumping into the shellcode. I'm also hoping that my shellcode is correct because I have no way to test it. So this is Mirachi in front of the shellcode. I eventually got her to move so that I could do the jump, and there was actually a chance of it working. And it didn't work the first time. I was annoyed. It was 2 minutes per try because I had to reflash the ROM. But I went through about all 255 of them, and every one of them, actually not every one of them froze. Almost all of them froze. A few of them, if I removed the figure, they would go back to normal. And then there was code CC. And code CC had some really interesting behavior. When I jumped to it, it would start to buzz. But it would only buzz if bit 3 of byte 68 of the LCD ROM was set. And otherwise, it would just freeze. And the other thing I noticed was there were a few middle indexes that worked. Originally, I'd thought that it was the ones at the top and ones at the bottom that were valid, and maybe those were even two separate jump tables, and otherwise I was jumping to invalid stuff. But because some stuff in the middle worked, I thought it must be a full valid jump table. And I thought that, well, maybe what's actually happening is that I am jumping to a valid address, but my stack isn't right. And this actually made a lot of sense considering the way that CC was behaving, because what I really thought it was is it sounded exactly like what would happen if you press the button on a Tamagotchi. If you press the button, it beeps, and this sounded like that beep over and over and over. So I thought maybe it's checking a value if the sound's enabled and playing it, then jumping somewhere. Except maybe where it's jumping to is wrong, so it's getting stuck in a loop. And maybe where it's checking is actually pointing into LCD RAM, which is why it's being impacted by that LCD RAM, which should really never change the control behavior of anything ever. At which point, I started going crazy. Because I thought, if I know that there's a pointer to LCD RAM, and I know the stack is getting messed up, why aren't I jumping to it if there's 255 possibilities? I mean, sure, I could be really, really unlucky and be lucky enough to have 200 vulnerabilities and none of them jump where I want to. But what I thought was more likely was that maybe my shellcode was wrong. And after all this, I found out it was. This is the instruction table you get, and I just assumed that it was the Sun Plus bytecodes you'd use, because why would you provide a table if you just used regular 6502 bytecodes? But apparently they did, and it was actually standard 6502 bytecodes. And as soon as I did that, the fourth issue I tried jumped directly to the code, and my device reset, which was my shell code. So that was really exciting. And here's sort of my proof of concept, and yes, I'm aware it is the lamest proof of concept ever. Circled in blue is the jump, so that's where I'm catching execution, and then it just jumps to the shell code in yellow, and then that shell code actually just makes the blocks of LCD white. And what I was actually trying to do here was to figure out where the LCD RAM was. Because I actually, it turns out, got very lucky here because the LCD RAM isn't contiguous. So I actually had just a really, really tiny NOP slide that I happened to get hit. And the rest of the NOPs in there, they were actually in other places in memory. So at this point, I was able to dump the ROM. I started off by writing code that would dump the entire memory space. And then I output it over the buttons. They're on port A for the Tamagotchi, so I broke them out, and then I turned them to being outputs, and then I could output SPI and get all the code, and then I decoded it with a signal analyzer. Unfortunately, on this particular chip, that wouldn't get all the code because it has a ROM bank that supports paging. So the top half of the memory space is always the same, and that's always page 0. But the bottom half of the memory space, it would be switched based on a port. And at this point, I didn't know what the port was. So I had to go through that first page of memory, and I figured out that it was actually at address 3000. You write the page that you want to change to, and then that will change the mapping of the lower half memory addresses. So with this, I was able to dump all 19 pages of ROM out of the buttons. And I could quickly figure out what they were. Pages 0 to 6 were code. 3 of them were blank. 1 of them contained a bunch of pointers and then a little bit of images. And then about 9 of them contained image data and 1 contained audio data. So, of course, the first thing I did was I dumped all the images and got the cutest part of dumping the ROM. So now one thing I was immensely curious about was the General Plus test program. Because you can remember earlier on, I'd gone to a lot of lengths to try and find this, and I thought that it would dump the code. So I was very curious. Was I right? Could it have actually dumped the code at all? So I went and took it out of the ROM and decoded what it did. So what it actually does is it pulls port 8 for a code. It will just figure out which bits are set and not, and that becomes a number, and then it will output the result on port B. And 2 of the codes looked interesting, code 3 and code 16. Code 3 was actually very unfortunate. This is the checksumming function. It was the one that I speculated existed to check if the ROM was right, if a customer complained. And it could checksum the entire ROM, but it could also checksum any location of any size. So you actually could checksum just 1 byte, which would have been a great way to dump the ROM from any General Plus chip, except there was actually a bug in it. When they did the range checksum, they forgot to change the port B back to being an output. So actually, I looked at it and it wouldn't work. So that was too bad. There was almost a way to dump code there. So the next one I saw was code 16, and this one's fantastic. It fills up the entire RAM with code and then just jumps to it. So this means that you can use this test program to dump any General Plus LCD ROM. All that's really needed is that port A, port B, and the test pin are bonded. And when you lower the test pin, when you restart the device, it will jump the instruction pointer into the test program instead of the regular program and start. So this is cool. This means that I can dump earlier Tamagotchis up to about version 3. Unfortunately, not the really, really old ones. And also might be useful for any other device that runs a General Plus microcontroller. So the next thing I did was, of course, I wanted to reverse the ROM. And I found the learning curve was steep. Partly because the first line of 6502 I'd ever written was my shell code, so I didn't know what a lot of the instructions did. Also, there was no paging support in IDA, which made it quite hard, because if you were jumping to a different page, there was no way to trace that. Eventually, I wrote a simulator based on Python, based on a Python library called Pi65, and I added support for some special things that are General Plus. I added support for the Tamagotchi LCD, and I added support for a few other things, the interrupts, that sort of thing. And this allowed me to decode the secrets of Tamagotchi life. So I think I've got a bit of extra time here, so I'm going to show you guys some of my tool here. It's really not very exciting. How do I get this up there? There we go. So it's actually, it's very slow because it has a lot of logging going on. Copy. There we go. So just it outputs every time you page. And then to actually get my Tamagotchi started, you have to kick the non-maskable interrupt. And then eventually they should start writing to the LCD. Well, I'm just going to leave that and hopefully it'll start running. So when I started going through the code, I found out that I was pretty much correct about how it worked. It was one big state table. Pretty much what happens is there's one loop, and it's triggered by a timer interrupt. So it'll go around and wait for the interrupt, and go around and wait for the interrupt. And every time it does this, it will do something based on the state it's in. And there's one of 41 states, and they're the things like eating and putting on clothing and going to the bathroom, all the stuff your Tamagotchi will do. And they can have substates and sub-substates and all that sort of thing. So there's a really large number of pointer tables inside the Tamagotchi, and it pretty much just controls going through all these states. So I was able to find out a few secrets at this point. What makes a Tamagotchi a girl or a boy? Well, it turns out it's determined by an entropy source. So there is nothing you can do to change whether your Tamagotchi is a girl or a boy. And actually, the way it's based on that entropy source, it's based on a timer. So it's actually based on how long you wait until you press the button to start your Tamagotchi hacking or hatching. What was interesting is also what toddler a baby grew into was completely random, sort of. So it doesn't matter how well or how poorly you take care of a Tamagotchi baby, it becomes the same thing. Except it's kind of evened out. So if you have one toddler, and then the next time you reset it, there's a 2/3 chance you'll get the toddler you didn't have before. And then the next time you reset, you get back to normal, and then the next time after that, it's the 2/3 chance you got the one you didn't have. So that's kind of cool. Also, I found out that some toddlers are higher maintenance than others. What teenager a toddler turns into is based on how well you care for it. And there's sort of a care factor. So if you take care of your Tamagotchi perfectly, this is 0, and every time you let it get sick or don't feed it, you get dinged. And some toddlers, it doesn't matter if you don't take care of them very well, you'll still get the best teen Tamagotchi. But some toddlers, the threshold is much lower. And if you even don't treat them very well at all, they'll become a bad Tamagotchi. So I thought that was kind of cool. And I found what adult a teen becomes depends on the care, but it also now depends on discipline or training. And I found that how you treated the toddler actually affected the adult. So if you treated the toddler really well, it wasn't very hard to get your teenager to turn into a good Tamagotchi. But if you treated your toddler terribly, you had a lot of making up to do to get it to be a good adult. So I thought that was fun. And finally, I discovered that you can potty train your Tamagotchi. I actually got a little bit confused about this at first, because I saw if your discipline was really high, then it would stop using the washroom, and I thought it just used the washroom less. But it actually turns out that's the only loop, and it stopped using the washroom altogether. And also I noticed that if you see your Tamagotchi doing the potty dance, and you drag it to the toilet, that will increase its discipline by 3. So pretty much you can potty train your Tamagotchi. So that's all the secrets I've found from the ROM so far, but I'm still working on it. So overall, I learned that you can dump the code of a Tamagotchi. And I found a way that you can actually dump all General Plus LCD chips. I learned a bit about Tamagotchi internals and the secrets of Tamagotchi life. And most important, good times were had by all, except for the Tamagotchis. So now I can take any question you guys have. Okay.
The questions that I can give if there's any good questions.
Okay, cool. So who's in the back? I told the guy that I'd dumped the code, so I don't think it's in the queue anymore. Yeah, I know. You really want to know what a Tamagotchi looks like up that close. Anyone else? No, they've been surprisingly quiet. I haven't heard from the chip maker, although after I did the pad thing, they no longer post any pad layouts. With regards to the makers of the Tamagotchi, I've heard absolutely nothing, which I suppose is good, that they're at least not so angry I'm doing this that they're sending me letters or anything. In the back. The one I dumped actually does support IR. So my next goal here is to come up with a Tamagotchi dev kit and to make a TVBgotchi, like a TV Be Gone, but using the IR of the Tamagotchi. Anyone else? Okay, that's great. Thanks a lot. And I do love hearing from people with questions, so if you have any more, feel free to email me or tweet at me. My information's on the slide.